Hello, my name is Alexa Barger. I'm a first-year graduate student in the Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Welcome to my presentation, New Bodies, Nouveau Commerce, Denise Baudu and Body Images. This presentation of an article in progress will examine discourses of the female body as articulated through Denise Baudu, the Normande protagonist of Emile Zola's 1883 novel, Au Bonheur des Dames. Though commonly perceived as an image of idealized womanhood, Denise Baudu is first presented in the novel as a social outsider, a provincial orphan of low socioeconomic class who arrives to Paris in order to care for the most vulnerable members of her remaining family. Described by scholar Anna Krakowski as malnourie, Denise is strikingly slender compared to the voluptuous curves of the bourgeoise female body. Her figure equally represents her ongoing maternal and material sacrifices for her younger brothers. When Denise is employed at Au Bonheur des Dames, the department store helmed by Octave Moret, her body size marks her as a further outsider, as her poverty, gender, and provincial origins are inscribed onto her figure. Still, I propose that Zola attributes a new form of mobility and agency to Denise through the representation of her body, particularly as she is degendered and displaced from pre-established categories of womanhood and sexuality. Denise's rise to prosperity in Au Bonheur des Dames is facilitated through the novelty of her frame. Even as Denise finds herself both perceived and temporarily defined by the gendered and class discourses of those around her, she defies categorization, enabling her triumphs in the workplace and in her romance with Moret. This presentation will focus on the first section of the article, which focuses on the interlinked conceptions of bodies, gender, and cultural difference, as well as the novel's initial presentation of Denise's body. In order to examine the image of the female body in this text, it is first valuable to consider the transforming beauty standards for women in the late 19th century in France. Whereas the standard of white feminine beauty here was partly defined by voluptuous curves, particularly during the Second Empire, Georges Vigarello notes an increased emphasis on slenderness in his 2010 study, The Metamorphoses of Fat. Quote, "There's an intensified will to thinness in the second half of the 19th century. The pressure is stronger, more frequent, and exercised first of all on the bodies of women." End quote. The societal pressures that Vigarello enumerates perhaps belong more closely to the end of the 19th century than to the era represented in Au Bonheur des Dames, set in the late 1860s. Still, before the late 19th century's will to thinness, the ideal woman's body is represented as voluptuous without excess, neither too thin nor too fat. Vigarello affirms that the word thinness must apply, in this quote, to the middle of the body, no matter what the expectations for other body parts, end quote. He asserts equally that, quote, "roundness is unthinkable without a certain delicateness and slenderness intermixed," creating a standard of bourgeois beauty that demanded constant, intentional sartorial and physical balance. Vigarello asserts as well that idealized slenderness is tied with class. The image of the working-class woman, full-figured or otherwise, would differ massively from, quote, "the type of woman described in issues of the periodical Monde Élégant. This second woman is lankier and more mobile. Thus there is the popular sensibility on one side and the elitist sensibility on the other. Female thinness thus undergoes a contradictory series of transformations, where the female slender body of higher class comes to be associated with present-day sophistication and mobility, perhaps associating it as well with transforming images of women throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These transformations, of course, are gradual, and the slender female body, outside of the Gentile and bourgeois context, equally encompasses more transgressive and unusual associations. It is equally valuable to consider several contributions to the image of othered feminine slenderness, partly through the transforming image of famed French-Jewish actress Sarah Bernard. Bernard was notable in part for her striking appearance, including her small frame, which permitted her to play roles that were not strictly female or feminine. Her unusual physical appearance associated her well with an increasing interest in Orientalist imagery, not only represented here with her representation of Cleopatra, but in her influence on the image of the Salome figure as reinterpreted by Oscar Wilde, though never performed by Bernard in the late 19th century. Jonathan Friedman writes as well that Bonheur's image diverged from prevailing models of Jewish femininity, in which plumpness was frequently prized. Moreover, this same body type was exemplified by other Jewish Salomés, which were all notoriously thin, and were culturally prized or condemned for this slenderness. End quote. Peter Wolin equally argues that the eventual convergence of Orientalist art and modernist aesthetics gave rise to another configuration of the female body, one that straddled gendered roles without sacrificing beauty. Quote, a more natural and functional figure, a more managed and nuanced image of sexual difference and focus of sexual display and desire. End quote. Once divorced from the equation of hypersexualized and Orientalist imagery, this bodily configuration creates a character who is, quote, from Friedman, thin, non-reproductive, capable of giving pleasure to and taking pleasure from men and women alike, end quote. Able to mobilize herself because she has escaped definition from a certain image of femininity, even as she corresponds to another expectation for female presentation. Though Denise's body is not fully associated with this image of Orientalist difference, nor was Bonheur's career associated with these images by 1883, it remains valuable to note the multiple spaces that Denise's body occupies at the beginning of the novel. While readers anticipate the full physical portrait of Denise Baudu, they witness her and her brother's arrival to Paris from Valognes, as well as their observations of the entry of Au Bonheur des Dames, the department store, whose sign is framed by two female statues with la gorge nue et renversée. This image links the department store with the female body and its sexuality, particularly as an advertising device. While her younger brothers cannot avert their gaze from these tantalizing and sexualized figures, former saleswoman Denise remains awestruck by the presentation of the store's goods. Her gaze, and that of the narration, turns towards a mannequin who embodies everything but Denise's own reality as a working-class woman. La gorge ronde des mannequins gonflait l'étoffe. Les hanches fortes exagéraient la finesse de la taille. La tête absente était remplacée par une grande étiquette. End quote. Attentive both to fabric and detail, Denise is aware of the presentation of the ideal consumer's silhouette, buxom and curvaceous, with the fine fabric of the waist meant to set the contrast between breasts and hips. The mannequin's head, however, has been replaced by a price tag, indicating that the department store intends to sell both the outfit itself and a reified and idealized model for the female consumer. American historian Leora Auslander notes that, among the bourgeois class, a model of domesticity, to begin the quote, with the woman and wife as consumer, was already becoming quite apparent in the developing genres of women's magazines, etiquette books, marriage manuals, and furnishing guides, end quote. A gendered ideal that is nevertheless only feasible for and accessible to a class and lifestyle to which Denise clearly does not belong. Denise is therefore already distinguished from ces belles femmes à vendre, as she must use her time and energy to instead negotiate an unfamiliar part of Paris in order to provide for her remaining family. Along with her provincial origins and unusual appearance, Denise undergoes a double configuration, as she is cast both into the maternal role by the text's expository structure and into the dynamic role of the transgressive female protagonist. Krakowski views Denise's initial description and characterization as an image of, quote, une véritable tendresse maternelle, tâchant de satisfaire même les menus caprices de ses protégés et qui continue courageusement la lutte quotidienne, son devoir de sa mère, end quote. Indeed, the first description of Denise juxtaposes her weary small body with the neediness of her younger siblings. Elle, chétive pour ses 20 ans, la pauvre, portait un léger paquet, tandis que, de l'autre côté, le petit frère, âgé de 5 ans, se pendait à son bras, et que, derrière son épaule, le grand frère, dont les Césaires superbes florissaient, était debout. End quote. Chétive indicates sickliness and malnutrition, potentially suggesting an inability to control one's biological or physical circumstances, as Denise cannot immediately shift her air pauvre. Furthermore, Denise appears to be held captive, if not by her body, then by her dependent brothers. Her so-called maternity is countered with a certain lexical field of infertility through extraction, of an appearance that emanates both poverty and ongoing loss. This becomes more readily apparent in another description of the siblings, where Jean avait la beauté d'une fille, begins Zola, une beauté qu'il semblait avoir volée à sa sœur. Denise paraissait plus mince encore, avec son visage long à bouche trop grande, son teint fatigué déjà, sous sa chevelure pâle. Denise, marked from the novel's beginning as a socioeconomic outsider, becomes further distinguished by her slimness. Noticeably, Jean is said to have la beauté d'une fille, stolen directly from his elder sister. The text not only foreshadows Jean's financial dependence on Denise, but also foregrounds Denise's degendered state. Especially if she is removed from the popular and bourgeois beauty standard of the Parisian woman. As Jean appears to extract his feminine beauty from Denise, she is rendered smaller and weaker, her body almost well overwhelmed by that which demarcates it as unusual and other. A too large mouth, and an unruly head of blonde hair, the latter of which becomes a focal point of criticism when she is employed by Mouret. Still, the impoverished Denise receives extraordinary agency, without being directly stigmatized by the narration for her lack of physical conformity. It is indeed her state of need, writ on her face and body, that leads to her employment. Robineau, qui la regardait avec intérêt, apitoyé sans doute par sa mine pauvre, se permit un renseignement. Je sais qu'on a besoin chez nous de quelqu'un. Though flustered by the presentation of this opportunity, l'idée d'y être la comblait d'orgueil. A feeling of potential pride that contrasts with her previous embodiment of poverty and financial and emotional exhaustion. Susan Harrell argues in turn that Denise's presentation at the novel's beginning demarcates the initiation of a greater social transformation. Quote, "The decisive journey of Denise to Paris illustrates a process of modernization that traverses gender and social class distinctions. Progressive, or at least progress-oriented individuals, lured by modernity in its economic, political, or cultural manifestations, gravitate to the city." End quote. Though she appears worn thin by poverty and her dependent siblings, unable to gain weight or support, initially due to her circumstances, Denise develops as a dynamic and transformative figure. Ultimately, she is hired at Au Bonheur des Dames, where her body becomes the site of derision, disruption, and eventually desire.